I wonder if there's ever been a time in your life where you wondered, is God actually at work? Most of us have probably asked that question of ourselves at one point or another, because when we read the Bible, his work seems so clear and so obvious, and yet when we look at our lives, it doesn't always seem so clear and obvious. And I think Esther is a great book to read and study when we're asking ourselves questions like that, because Esther reminds us that God is at work even when we don't think we see him at work. We're working our way through the writings, and we've come to the book of Esther, and the events in this book take place about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. So this book is late in Israel's history, Old Testament-wise at least. To put it in perspective, 607 BC, captivity begins in Babylon. 586 BC, Babylon invades and destroys Jerusalem. 538 BC, Babylon is defeated by Cyrus the Persian king. 537 BC, first exiles return from captivity. 535 BC, the altar and foundation of the temple are begun with Zerubbabel. 522 to 486 BC, you have the Persian king Darius. 520 BC, you have Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets. And then 516 BC, the temple is finished and dedicated. And while several thousand Jews did return to Jerusalem, many did not, and they lived in places throughout the Persian Empire. In 486 to 465 BC, you have the Persian king Xerxes, and then in the 470s BC, Esther is queen of Persia. Now, during this time, there's a great threat that takes place to the entire Jewish people, and Esther tells the story of their deliverance from that. The title of the book comes from one of the main characters, and this is the only place in the Bible, actually, that she's mentioned, and she's mentioned 55 times here. Esther is her Gentile name, and her Hebrew name is Hadassah. The other main characters are King Xerxes, that's his Greek name at least. He's the son of Darius. He's mentioned in Ezra 4:6. He had a huge empire from India to Ethiopia, and he's known, like any other emperor, I suppose, with that kind of empire, as ambitious. He was ruthless. He was intolerant. His capital city was Susa, which is somewhere in modern-day Iran, and he was eventually assassinated in his own bedroom. Vashti is another character. She's only at the beginning of the story. She's the wife of Xerxes at that point. She's beautiful. She ends up being deposed as queen. You have Mordecai. He's the cousin of Esther. Some people think he's actually the one who wrote this book. He was a Benjamite. Remember how there are all these different tribes. And who else was a Benjamite? The most famous Benjamite was Saul, of course. Haman, the Agagite, Esther 3:1. Agag is another pretty famous biblical name, and it comes from 1 Samuel 15. Agag was a Amalekite. Amalekites are mentioned first in Exodus 17. They were the first group to attack Israel as they were leaving Egypt, and at that point God makes a promise. He says, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And he charges Israel to do this in Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear the Lord. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God has given you to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget." And yet, Saul does forget. In 1 Samuel 15, God sends Saul to destroy the Amalekites, but Saul doesn't. And who is the king of the Amalekites? It's a man named Agag. We don't know exactly who wrote Esther. It could have been Mordecai, but it was probably written a little after Xerxes' death, because there's a summary of his reign in chapter 10, verse 2. But whoever wrote it was very familiar with the Persian Empire, and so it most likely had to be someone from that era, which is why people suggest Mordecai. In the Hebrew Bible, it's placed between Lamentations and Daniel. So there's Ruth, there's Song of Songs, there's Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And putting Esther after Lamentations makes sense because Lamentations is a sad book. And it's really asking God, what has happened as our enemies have defeated us? And Esther is a pretty happy book where God's enemies are defeated. It's easy to see why it's put before Daniel as well. Those two books seem to go together because they both were written about people in exile, and they showed Jews rising up to high places in foreign courts, and God's taking care of them, though in very, very different ways. In fact, one of the strangest things about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned in the book. It's actually only one of two books in the Old Testament where the name of God's not mentioned, Song of Songs and Esther. Song of Songs has a possible mention, but God's not mentioned directly anywhere in Esther. And that's why there have been people throughout history who have not liked this book, actually, like Martin Luther. Some say it is a secular book in the Bible, but there's a purpose to this. There's a reason. It's not because they forgot God, obviously. This is a technique. The author, what he wants us to do is to look for God's activity as we're reading. Where is he? What's he doing? One scholar says, when we scrutinize the text of Esther for traces of God's activity, we're doing what the author wants us to do, and in fact has written this book in such a way almost to force us to do. Like any other book of the Bible, Esther has a couple of purposes. One purpose is practical. There is one sacred festival that the Jews celebrated that wasn't directly established by Moses in the Pentateuch, and it's called the Feast of Purim. And the establishment of that festival is found in the book of Esther. So it explains why they celebrated this festival, the book of Esther. Esther 9:20-23, Esther 9:26-28. The day before the feast is kept as a solemn fast. On the day of the feast, the people assemble in the synagogue, where the book of Esther is read amid hand clapping and feet stamping. These are intended to show contempt for Haman and joy for the deliverance of the Jews. After leaving the synagogue, there would be great feasts at home. And then there's a bigger theological purpose. So the practical purpose to explain the feast. They read the book of Esther at the feast. Then there's a bigger theological purpose, and it is written to remind God's people of God's ability to keep his promises in surprising ways, even when it doesn't look like he's anywhere around. If you look at chapter 1 is basically the story of a pagan king in a pagan land. So it provides the setting for the book. There are two huge feasts that this king is celebrating in the third year of his reign. All of his officials and servants and the armies of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors have come, and the text says he shows them the riches of his glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for 180 days. Imagine, a 180-day party. Now, historically, many people think this fits right into the time when Xerxes was planning on invading Greece. Greece had defeated his father, and many think he was out for vengeance. And so it makes sense that he's bringing in his armies to plan this great invasion and also perhaps to give confidence to them as they go to invade. And he ends this first 180-day feast with a second special 7-day feast for all the people, for the whole city. And verse 6 talks about what that was like, and it's just elaborate. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, couches of gold, drinks served, and basically they're all getting drunk, everybody. Then at the same time, Vashti, his queen, is having a party for the women, and by the 7th day, the writer of Esther says that Xerxes' heart is just merry with wine, which means he's pretty much wasted. And he thinks it would be a great idea to have Vashti come so that all the men who are with him could see how beautiful she is, for she was lovely to look at. Now, she does something that's just shocking, and she says that she's not coming. Verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And we don't know why she refused to come. Some say it was because she was pregnant. I don't know, maybe she's drunk too. But whatever reason, This wasn't acceptable to the king, and he becomes angry. And we're going to see this coming up over and over again. This was one angry pagan king. And why is he angry? He's angry because this is public humiliation. And so he gets his advisors together and he asks them what he should do. And they say, you better take this seriously in verse 16. Why? For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. So they say she needs to be replaced. And everybody needs to know why. Verse 20. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed through all his kingdom, for it's vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. And this advice pleases the king, so he sends out the decree, verse 22, that every man be master in his own household. And that's funny, that's kind of ironic, because the book of Esther really, ultimately, we're going to see, is about a woman who turns the heart of the king. And so there's a little bit of irony. But Xerxes is known for his temper, and this is just a small display. I was reading recently that just a year later, in order for his massive army to march from Turkey, where they were assembled, into Greece, Xerxes ordered that the bridges be built across a certain river, a narrow piece of water between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, that they needed to get through to get to Greece. And the bridges were destroyed in a storm before the troops were able to use them. And he was so furious that the storm destroyed the bridges that his soldiers had built. He thought that they must have been built inadequately by the engineers. So he gathered all the engineers together and chopped their heads off. He was then furious with the water. So Herodotus, the historian, the Greek historian, says he sent soldiers into the water with whips, demanding that they lash the ocean or the river, whichever it was, 300 times for insubordination. And then he sent soldiers who threw shackles into the water to bind the water and to stab the waves with red-hot iron. So this is an angry guy and a little bit of a crazy guy. You never know what he's going to do. Chapter 2, a Jew is chosen queen and a Jew protects the king. Chapter 1, a pagan king in a pagan land, the setting. Chapter 2, the story is starting to ramp up. A Jew is chosen queen. About 4 years go by. Esther's 2:16 says it was the 7th year of his reign. Why 4 years? Well, after this celebration and all this planning, he spent 2 years trying to invade Greece. And then he comes home and he tries to distract himself because he hadn't won the way he wanted to win. And so he needs a new queen. And the people around him come up with a plan in verses 2 and 3. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let the beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem and Susa, the capital, under custody of Higal, the king's eunuch who's in charge of the women. And this pleased the king, obviously. And let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti, verse 4. And so he did what the young men told him to do. And by the way, what we're seeing so far is what? It's just sort of the story of a pagan king being pagan. Pagans are going to peg, I guess, and he's being pagan. And the question that we're asking is, where's God? Here's this guy who gets rid of his queen in a drunken rage, and now he's having a sort of a beauty pageant with all the virgins, and he's just going to pick one for himself. And he just seems like he's doing whatever he wants to do. It seems so random, right? But is it random? Chapter 2, verse 5. Now there was a Jew, and we meet finally Mordecai, and we meet Esther. They're cousins. Mordecai was about 15 years older. And the first thing we learn about Esther is that this young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter, which seems pretty superficial so far. Here's this beautiful woman. She's nice to look at. But that's actually important for the story. There are about 50 million people in the Persian Empire. So he had probably about 25 million women to pick from. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, said they picked 400. 400 of the most beautiful women to take back to the palace and to be part of the king's harem and to participate in this contest to become queen. They were going to live there for a year and get ready. And at the end, each one would have an opportunity to go before the king, and he would make his choice. You see that in verses 12 through 14. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Xerxes or Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments. For women, when the women went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired. She was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. And she would go in the evening and come out in the morning, and he would make his decision. Now, Esther's not letting anyone know she's a Jew. And she's not actually acting like one, you know. She's going into a pagan king at night. That's not really a good thing. And again, we're asking, where's God? Here's this Jew who's acting in a strange way. Here's this king who's acting in a pagan way. But there's just something about Esther. She pleased the eunuch in verse 9, verses 16 through 18. She pleases the king. She's winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, and she's brought before the king. And after she's brought before the king and chosen by the king loved Esther more than all the women, and he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti, and he decides to have another party. And right after this party, to celebrate Esther, and right after this party, Mordecai, her cousin, sitting at the gate, and it seems like Mordecai must have had some position in the government. And the phrase sitting at the gate, people think is a little technical, like it's actually an official title. And what he's able to hear isn't an ordinary conversation. So it could have been that he got this job because of Esther, or he had it before. But either way, he happens to overhear a plot to assassinate the king, and he lets Esther know. And Esther lets the king know in the name of Mordecai, and the men are hanged, and it's written down in the king's book. And it's kind of left at that at the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, Haman plots to kill the Jews. We're next introduced to Haman, the Agagite, who's a descendant of the Canaanites, the Amalekites specifically. And he's elevated, and he orders everyone to kneel to him, and Mordecai won't kneel. It's not surprising. This Agag and the Jews, they had a deep family feud. And obviously, Mordecai was a descendant of Saul, and there was a massive failure on Saul's part that was one of the reasons he was deposed as king. So this must have been known to Mordecai, and he's not going to just bow to Haman. And this makes Haman incredibly angry, because it's not just once, it's over and over and over that Mordecai refuses to bow to him. And Haman decides he wants to get this over with and destroy not just Mordecai, but the whole race of the Jews. This is a big deal. This is like the war from Satan is warring against God's seed. And so what does he do in verse 7? He goes to the magicians and he starts casting lots to decide the best day to annihilate the Jewish people. And then in verse 8, he goes into the king, and crazy king says, let's do it. He gives his signet ring to Haman, which was something they used to stamp the royal documents. He gets the scribes together, Haman, he makes a decree, and he sends out messengers everywhere to let everyone know the day when they're all going to kill the Jews. This is Esther 3:13. Letters were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Horrible. And after that, the king and Haman sit down to get drunk. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. The city's in chaos. And again, you're asking what? You're asking, where's God? Where's God? Pagan king doing pagan things, Esther doing unusual things. strange things, not quite right things. Mordecai saving the king, but nothing seems to happen. And then Haman actually attacking Mordecai, and not just Mordecai, all the Jews, and getting away with it to this point. Where's God? It just looks like he's gone. And that's the way the Jews felt when they heard this in chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. It's like he's going to a funeral. It's the funeral of the Jews. This is not just Haman and Mordecai. This is not even just Haman and the Jews. This is Satan against the human race. The savior of the human race is going to come from the Jews. And so, of course, Satan wants all the Jews to be killed. Esther, here in chapter 4, hears about this, and she commits to helping the Jews. She hears about Mordecai, and I don't know why she's not up to speed on this, but maybe living in the king's palace, they're not knowing all the news. But she doesn't know why Mordecai's acting the way he is, crying the way he is, doing what he's doing, and so she sends him clothes. She doesn't like this, and he won't accept it, and he tells her what's going on, and he tells her what to do, to go into the king and plead with him, but Esther says it's not that simple, Esther 4:11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there's but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Approaching the king without being requested to is possible death. And you can think about how seriously he took women overstepping their bounds in regards to what he did to Vashti. Mordecai then calls on her to be courageous, and this is one of the most important parts of the whole book, Esther 4:14. He says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai is trusting in God's sovereignty and God's faithfulness to his promise. This is really a great statement of faith. God is going to take care of his people somehow. He's able. But who knows whether or not you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This is your time. And so Esther calls on the Jews to fast, and she's going to fast, and then she's going to go to the king, even though it's against the law, and she says, if I perish, I perish. Chapter 5, everything's been going wrong. Haman plans on killing Mordecai. And yet this is the chapter where everything starts to change. Esther goes into the king. The king is pleased. Esther 5:2 says she won favor with the king. And then again, Esther 5:4, she says, if it pleases the king, I want to have a party. I want to have a party for you and for Haman. Interesting. In Hebrew, let the king and Haman come, verse 4. The first letters of each of those words is Yahweh. And it may be, it may not be, but it may be that the author's kind of whispering here by his very choice of words, don't miss what God's doing. God is at work behind the scenes. And she wants to have a banquet. Verse 5, she asks again for them to come to the banquet, and the king asks her again, what do you want? And verse 6, she says, I want to have another banquet. And that's funny. I don't know why she has this one banquet and the king likes it so much she wants to have another banquet. Maybe she feels like the timing's not right. Maybe it was just fear at the first banquet. So she's like, let's do this again. Let's try it again. Whatever. Haman goes home and he's so happy, but he sees Mordecai on his way home, and this makes him angry. There's no fear. There's no bowing. There's no respect. And so he goes home and he gets his friends together and he tells them about everything that's happening. And especially verse 12, even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And what's this? This is a pagan man's interpretation of events. He's looking at how things are happening, and this is his explanation. Now, is this the right explanation? No, but that's life. people don't always see what God's doing. And God's actually doing the opposite here of what this unbeliever thinks. Though you can understand why he's thinking the way he's thinking about his life at this point. In spite of all the good stuff, though, he's upset. Verse 13. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And his wife and his friends say, let's build a gallows to have Mordecai hanged. Or it could just be a stake. They impaled people those days. Either way, he wants to kill Mordecai, and Haman sets that plan in motion. But chapter 6, the king honors Mordecai. It seems like things can't get worse at this point. But that night, the king goes to bed and he can't sleep. Why can't he sleep? Well, we know why he can't sleep. God is in control of all the details. But he wants help sleeping, and so he calls on his servants to bring the book of memorable deeds and read it to him. And they read it, and they read about Mordecai, and he realizes he hasn't honored Mordecai for this, which was a big deal to the king. Punish those who were disloyal, honor those who were loyal. So he says, who's hanging around the court right now? I need to talk to them. And you won't believe it, but Haman has just come back to speak to the king about killing Mordecai. And the servants say, well, Haman's here. And Haman comes in, and the king asks him the question that Haman has been waiting his whole life to hear. He says, what shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And what does Haman think? What would we think? Whom would the king want to honor more than me? And so he's telling him, so he goes on to tell him what he's dreaming would be done for him, Haman. Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, I know it's me. Let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And the king is like, that is a great idea. Let's do it quickly. Go and do everything you just told me for Mordecai. And in case Haman's confused, verse 10, he says, leave out absolutely nothing that you mentioned to me. Imagine Haman at this point. And this is really the pivot for the whole book. Haman has been rising to power. The Jews look like they're in trouble, specifically Mordecai. It looks like God's forgotten them. But now, Mordecai begins rising to power, and Haman looks in trouble. And what's had to happen for this to take place? Think back. You've had to have a drunk king. You've had to have a rebellious queen. You had to have one beautiful orphan chosen out of 25 million women. You had to have the king taking pleasure in Esther. You had to have Mordecai overhearing some plot. You had to have him be in the right place to overhear that plot. You had to have the king forget to honor Mordecai. You had to have the king not able to sleep. You had to have the king happen to read the part about Mordecai. And you had to have Haman happen to come back to talk to the king at that very moment and feeling so confident about his relationship with the king. That's a lot of coincidences. Or providence. God is at work. And Haman, because the king's the king, has to honor Mordecai. And in verse 11, he does it as quickly as he can. And then he goes home and he's mourning and he tells his friends. And what does his wife say at this point? Verse 13. She says, I knew it. If Mordecai, before whom you've begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. She doesn't even know why, but she does know God's with the Jews. And that's the point. That's the point. You can try, but you are not going to win against God. God always will accomplish exactly what he wants to accomplish, even when to the whole world it looks like he's gone to sleep. And so while they're talking, the servants come and hurry to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. And in chapter 7, Haman is exposed and hanged. The king and Haman sit down to talk and eat with Esther, and they're drinking again, and they ask what does she want? And she tells him finally, if I found favor in your sight, I am Jewish, and Haman has ordered the death of the Jews. And in verse 6, the king is so upset by what he hears that he gets up to go think, and Haman starts begging for his life, of course, before Esther. And verse 8, the king comes back, and what's happening? Haman's falling on the couch where Esther was, and the king says, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Imagine, everyone knew. It's done. And the king commands Haman to be hanged or impaled on the stake he had prepared for Mordecai, which is at Haman's house. And so in chapter 8, the Jews are saved. And so this one big problem is out of the way. Haman has been killed, the Jews' great enemy. And actually, things start to get better. The king actually takes off his signet ring and gives it to Mordecai, and he gives it to Esther to give to Mordecai, and Esther sets Mordecai over the house of Haman. But there's still a fundamental problem that exists, and that's the fact that there's this order or decree, and Xerxes can't rescind the decree. And so Esther goes back to the king in verse 5, and she asks him, if I've found favor, I need your help. And the way she talks makes it sound like the king's in charge, but who's actually in control? God. God is behind this. That's the point of the book of Esther. And so the king says, okay, you can make a decree, and he says that the Jews can defend themselves on the day that's set aside to kill them. And so now, instead of mourning, what do the Jews do? Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, this is verse 15, in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many people from the Jews, or many people from the countries, many from the people of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. This is a great reversal. How could it happen? It's God. It's God. In chapter 9, the Jews' enemies are defeated, and a feast is instituted. And we read that on the day that the Jews were supposed to be killed, what happened? The reverse. And instead of the Jews being killed, their enemies were killed. And that's kind of the story of Esther. It's a story of great reversals. And in verses 2 through 10 of chapter 9, the king hears about all this and says, wow, what else do you want, Esther? And she says, give us one more day. I want one more day. And you can notice as you read what happened. The Jews defeated their enemies, but no one laid hand on the plunder, verse 10. No one laid hand on the plunder, verse 15. No one laid hand on the plunder, verse 16. So you see this, you get this picture of the Jews actually reversing what Satan was trying to accomplish. He was trying to accomplish the defeat of the Jews. Instead, the Jews defeat their enemies, but they don't take their enemies' stuff. Why? Well, this goes back to the mistake, or the sin, really, that Saul committed when he failed to listen to God and did plunder his enemies. And so what we see here is not just a reversal in this book, but we see a reversal over the course of 100 years, hundreds of years, where Saul failed, these Jews succeeded. They obeyed God, and they established the Feast of Purim. And that was just a way to remember the way in which God had taken care of them. And in chapter 10, Mordecai is exalted. God's not done yet. This is just a short little chapter, but it's an important chapter, because in verse 3 we read that Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. What a book. The book opens with the king's greatness and ends with Mordecai's greatness. The book has this story of this orphan girl who is basically in a sense, taken captive by the king. You can think about that, right? She didn't really have a choice in this. And yet she ends up being loved by the king, favored by the king, and saving the Jews. We see this elevation of the Jews' enemy, Haman, at the beginning. In the end, we see Mordecai feasting, the one Haman hated actually succeeding. We see all these great reversals. And in the end, we see Haman humiliated, the Jews' enemies humiliated, and Mordecai and the Jews exalted. Now, looking back on Esther, of course, there's a lot of moral ambiguity actually in this book. There's, for example, a lot of drinking. There's a lot of disobedience. Esther herself is a little bit confusing, but what do? They do end up trusting God and believing God and acting in obedience to God. And the point is really that despite exile, despite God's seeming absence, despite Israel's moral ambiguity, moral compromise, God has not abandoned his promises. God is still at work in the chaos. God will work through sinful people. And the question is, when you can't see God, will you trust God and that he will keep his promises? If you think about what does Esther teach you about God, it's actually quite a lot. For a book where God's not mentioned, he's actually everywhere. And that's really the point. John MacArthur writes, "The invisible hand of God is evident everywhere, everywhere. The absence of God here, I think, is intentional. It's an ingenious strategy by the writer to draw the reader to think deeply about how life circumstances are ordered to the divine purpose. These are not coincidences. This is not random. There is a designer, there's a coordinator, there's a power behind all this. God literally thunders throughout the book of Esther. There are no miracles in the book of Esther, but the whole thing is a miracle of divine providence. People, places, time, action. It's more than miraculous. Not Haman, not Satan using Haman, could destroy the people of God, could put an end to the Abrahamic promises, to the promises of preservation, the preservation of the nation, for the coming of the Messiah and the ultimate salvation of Israel. No one, no matter how hard they try to destroy the people of God, can succeed because of God's faithful love for Israel and his faithfulness to his promises. And the message for you is this: while you're going through life and you're trying to make sure that you fix all the little pieces of your life, understand this, that there is over and in and above and below your life a divine architect ordering every detail. And if you belong to him and are in the covenant of his love, he's accomplishing his perfect will. And you can rest in that. You can rest in that. The Lord is on his throne. These are challenging times that we're living in, challenging days to live in. And you can become pretty distressed about the way things are going. The way things are going in this world seems chaotic, seems disconcerting, seems troubling, seems disturbing, seems distressing, seems frightening. But God is at work. The divine architect of history is ordering our lives. Those of us who belong to him and are in covenant love with him, he is ordering our lives to his eternal glory, every part. How wonderful to live in that confidence, right? God is involved in the lives of his people, and he's accomplishing his plan even when seeing his plan and seeing his involvement is difficult. The goal of the book of Esther, why is it here? It's to teach us to have confidence even when we don't understand what's going on, and even when we don't see God at work. He's at work. You can count on it.